Welcome to Ideas in Action, the official University of Southern California podcast. Shows are webcast live on Facebook from Studio 1A in the USC Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism.
I'm Dr. Alyssa Richardson, Assistant Professor of Communication and Journalism.
Hi, and I'm Jody Armour, Roy P. Crocker Professor of Law at the University of Southern California Law School, Gould.
And we're coming to you today because it's February, and that means it's Black History Month. And we want to start off in the way that our ancestors would have, by honoring those who came before us, whose birthdays occurred during this month. Luminaries such as Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois, as well as people we'd like to remember like Trayvon Martin, who would have been 25 years old this month. And so this is a great time for us to talk about some of these intersections between journalism and justice. And by invoking that name of Trayvon Martin, we continue that tradition of speaking not only those names, but also the things that led them to be part of our national story and part of American history. And so one of the things I'm excited to talk about today with you, Professor Armour, is your forthcoming book. And your forthcoming book, as you'll discuss with us, investigates so thoroughly all of the things that we should know about how media are reporting on justice and trials and how the words we select can even impact people's thoughts about the outcome of a trial before it even happens. Can you talk a little bit about how my colleagues in the press are doing in terms of reporting news and how your work picks up there?
Yeah, well, I think your work, Dismantling Respectability, Alyssa, I read the article before we got together, and it's fabulous kind of in itself, dissection of how communication styles matter in moving social movements along, and how the Black Lives Matter movement itself, which, since you mentioned Trayvon Martin, was birthed as a result of the acquittal of George Zimmerman for gunning down Trayvon Martin. And it wasn't, the hashtag didn't crop up initially when Trayvon Martin was shot. It cropped up after the acquittal, after a jury sat back as expositors of community values, speaking for the community, and said there's nothing that we've seen that happened here that we find objectionable or unreasonable. And it reminded me of the 92 riots in LA. They didn't erupt when there was the videotape beating of Rodney King over and over, was saturating the airwaves. People waited for justice, and only when the Simi Valley jury, returned that acquittal of the officers that everyone saw with their own eyes beating Rodney King, when the promise of justice seemed so flagrantly flouted by that acquittal, by that jury, did we have this eruption, this mass protest, you could call it. Some people call it a riot, some people call it an uprising, a rebellion. And again, the media played a key role in both the Trayvon Martin case, the Rodney King case, the Black Lives Matter movement generally. And I think a lot of what the Black Lives Matter movement did, as you point out so brilliantly in your Dismantling Respectability piece, is it made an end run around legacy media and said, we're going to take control of the narrative ourselves and frame it ourselves. So I'm throwing that back at you now. Tell me a little bit about how you saw the Black Lives Matter movement leadership, although they view themselves very much as kind of leaderless movement in a lot of ways. It's a community movement, but there are some salient, prominent names. What you saw as their alternative to the legacy media and how it made it work, made the most important social movement of our recent time, last 20, 30 years, I'd say, how they made it work.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the things that fascinated me most as I researched my book, and it will be out in May. It's called Bearing Witness While Black: African Americans, Smartphones, and the New Protest Journalism. And I was fascinated by how people were using smartphones to share their truths. And I started out as a mobile media or mobile journalism instructor. And so I was going all around the world showing folks how to use their cell phone to create their own kind of one-woman or one-man show, right? And I think the initial practice of that was look at what we can do with these great cell phones. But then as I began to see uprisings such as the Arab Spring and Occupy Wall Street, and then Ferguson being captured almost exclusively by cell phone in those initial shots, that's when I said, this is a real movement that is not going to slow down. And so when it came back to the domestic side, when I came back home from teaching in Africa and saw the true uprisings, that first month that I started my doctoral program was when Mike Brown was killed. I said, this dissertation has to change. You know, my study just can't be, how do mobile phones affect young women who are in Africa tell their stories? It is now, how are African Americans continuing some very long work that's been enabled by these devices? And as I began to do that research, I began to see that this is not a new project, right? And so I'm so glad that you invoked the name of Rodney King, because he is the first true footage that we have that's been captured by a civilian who was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and still justice was not served. And so I even went back farther than that and said, were there any other instances where African Americans were bearing witness to things, and what tools did they use? Because we didn't always have cell phones, right? And so what I found was there were these three overlapping eras of domestic terror against African Americans, starting from slavery in 1619 all the way to the Civil War ending in 1865. And then with Reconstruction right away, backlash beginning in the form of lynching and the enforcement of Jim Crow law, of which I'm sure you're familiar. And then from there, from 1865 all the way to 1964, almost 100 years of fighting for civil rights. And then that civil rights movement then coming to an end, so to speak, with the passage of that law. Then police brutality kicking up, right? And that new front line of mass incarceration being police brutality. That's the first encounter many have with the law, and that being the unfinished work of those ancestors. And so I started to say, throughout those three periods, although they ended, there was always an African-American witness who was using the technology of their time to tell that story. So you had Frederick Douglass with slave narratives, you had Ida B. Wells using those black newspapers, you had John Lewis, who as a college student knew, we have to take pictures of our sit-ins and pictures of all of these things we're doing and sell them to the nightly news, which was only 15 minutes long, and put these images in front of people so they know what's going on. And that work is continued with Black Lives Matter and the activists who said, I'm going to release what police are doing in my neighborhood. And I think when they've done that kind of work, it's made it very difficult to enforce law in ways that you've done before. And I think that's why, as you mentioned, there have been so many uprisings when we see acquittals of police, but I am hopeful that laws are changing, specifically here in California, where police misconduct files are no longer private. And we have a consortium of journalists who are digging into those files for the very first time to see what we didn't know. And Oscar Grant, perished right here in California, and his was one of the first files that were reopened to see what actually happened on that BART platform at Fruitvale Station. And so I think this is what dovetails so wonderfully with your work, is because you discuss privilege a lot. In fact, I really enjoyed your interview on Chelsea Handler's documentary where you talked about privilege and had her come and visit your group. And the students were just so sharp and so aware that they have a voice and that they can challenge traditional mechanisms of power or media just by asking hard questions. And I believe they're emboldened to do that because of you and what you're teaching them. Can you talk a little bit more about what your classroom is like? How do they get that courage, that grit to challenge her that way?
Well, yeah, I like the way you set it up, the transitions, the different eras of social struggle in Black America, especially from the Civil Rights Movement era, John Lewis, to the era we're in now, Black Lives Matter. And again, one of the things you point out in Dismantling Respectability is how the style changed. And my style changes with my students. How the style, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but how the style changed from respectability politics, which was really the hallmark of the civil rights era we associate with Martin Luther King, in which you had respectable kinds of poster folk to represent good Negroes, mm-hmm. and to endear themselves to white America and to appeal to the white gaze. And Black Lives Matter involves a lot of blacks sometimes who are running away from the police when they're shot in the back, who aren't morally immaculate, who aren't Rosa Parks, for example, mm-hmm. Who aren't Medgar Evers or MLK, And BLM is coming in and saying they don't have to be to deserve respect and human dignity and not to be treated in an inhumane way. We need to move away from respectability politics, which is about good Negroes versus bad Negroes and trying to look good in the eyes of whites so that we can curry favor with them and they'll look on us favorably when they are making social policy decisions that involve weighing our community's interest against competing interests. We need to move away from that towards a kind of politics that embraces those who are even imperfect in our community. And that's why I call my book, for example, Nigga Theory. My Twitter handle is Nigga Theory. My first article in a law review was Nigga Theory, contingency, irony, and solidarity in the substantive criminal law. But before the colon, it was still Nigga Theory. And a lot of people find that blood-soaked epithet very objectionable and very disreputable. And it's meant to, in style, go after the politics of respectability and then in substance show why that politics is rooted in such shaky moral and political grounding. Chris Rock launched his comedy career with a routine called Bring the Pain many years ago. It used to be in all the black households I went in which he went back and forth in front of a black audience, mostly black audience, and said it's like a civil war going on in black America. And there are two sides. There's black people and there are niggas. Boy, I love black people, but I hate niggas. Niggas have got to go. Boy, I wish they'd let me join the Ku Klux Klan. Shit, I'd do a drive-by from here to Brooklyn. And he continues like that for 45 minutes, assailing what he calls niggas. And his core definition of a nigga is a black person who does a crime. Well, by that definition, the up to 90% of young black males in some of our urban neighborhoods who are going to wind up in jail, on probation, or on parole at some point in their lives are niggas. Now, what kind of politics relegates that chunk of your community, of your youth, to niggadom, to otherness, to moral condemnation, right? And so what I'm trying to do with Nigga Theory is attack that distinction. Say that it is invalid, it is illegitimate, and we need to go beyond it if we're going to achieve any kind of real racial and social justice. So one of the things I saw in your work when you in Dismantling Respectability, I can't wait for the book now to come out, is that not only did the Black Lives Matter proponents, many of them, and they're not all Black Lives Matter activists, but many of them were that you were talking about, not only do they reject respectability politics in substance, but also in style. For example, they embody their discourse. You talk about the way they embodied their discourse. I've had to embody my discourse through my choice of follicle fashion. You know, my afro, which was inadvertently grown, I wasn't even thinking about it, I just missed some trips to hear architects while I was writing my book on sabbatical. When I went back to school, some of my students I overheard saying it's ironic that Professor Armour teaches criminal law while he looks like a criminal. I went downtown and talked to some downtown attorneys about commercial transactions. They called back to the school and reported to some of my colleagues that Professor Armour's appearance is impertinent and unprofessional. Fortunately, this thing called tenure that, you know, some of us have and you're going to have soon. Or in pursuit of, yes. Some of us are going to have soon, some of us have. It's a great free speech lubricant. And, it gave me the ability, the license to go ahead and say, grow, baby, grow, when it came to this follicle fashion that some found so abrasive, right? This became a non-linguistic form of symbolic communication, a kind of bat signal to Black Lives Matter, to show solidarity with them. But I like the way that you talked about how these other folks were embodying their discourse that you looked at. Could you talk a little bit more about that, please?
Yes, I love all of what you just said, because so many of the activists that I've interviewed said that they were very intentional about how they show up in the world. One of the most interesting people who also lend his art to the cover of the book is Devin Allen, and he also has the same, afro, and he loves growing it out, reshaping it, cutting it. And one of the things that he said to me was, I was just so taken aback by how many people said, I love your afro, it's so intimidating. And he said, is this a compliment? And he says that in the book, and he says, I wasn't really sure how to take that at first, but as a photographer, I knew that images mattered, and so I kept my hair the way it was. And so one of the things that he did is he started out as an amateur selling, his photography and putting it on Instagram, doing all the things that people would tell you to do in your grassroots. But when the Freddie Gray uprisings occurred, he went out and he said, no, I'm not a member of the traditional press corps, but this is my neighborhood. And I knew people who knew him. I didn't know him personally, but I am friends with several of his friends. And he felt that he should be there. And so he embodied that discourse not only with his hair, his style of dress in that day, but also his gaze, because he said, I'm going to show not only the good sides of Baltimore, because I know they're going to show the fire and the brimstone, but I want to show what everyday Baltimore looks like too. And so he went and showed all of the peaceful uprisings that occurred. He actually shot the iconic cover for Time magazine of the man who has the bandana on running down the street. And it has 2015 crossed out in 1965 written in red. And he's only the third amateur to appear on the cover of Time magazine. And Devin told me, I think that me being there really enabled other people to see many different sides of Baltimore. And for me, being there and having people trust me in that space is because I looked like them. I embodied what it is I was trying to protest, which was a mainstream, one-note account of what happened in the days after Freddie Gray's passing. And so it was a real project for me, because as someone who is going into these spaces with relative ease because of how I looked, I had a lot of colleagues who asked, how did you get access? And there were so many people who were just like, I'm so glad you wanted to talk to me about this. And come on, sis. It was more of a familial type of interaction many times when I went into these spaces. Because, for instance, when I went to go meet with Devin Allen, he said, let's meet in my favorite store. It's called City of Gods. And right next door was a barber shop. And I'm well versed in those worlds because I've taken my brother to get his hair cut his whole life. Or now I have a black son. I'm taking him to go get certain styles done. And so I know how to move in those spaces. So when he wasn't immediately there, I had a student with me and she's like, what do we do? We're here in Baltimore. We're stuck. I said, we're not stuck. If there's a barber shop, that's a newsroom.
Yes.
And so I go in. Hey, everybody, how you doing? Does anyone know where I can find Devin? We have, an interview scheduled today. And they said, who? And so I said, the photographer, he's from here. Oh, you mean Moody? Yeah, Moody. Yeah, we know him. And so they go and they start texting, and then he appears, right? And so those kind of soft skills of navigating and embodying what it is you're studying, I think, are so important. And I think that's why I had so many people who were willing to participate in this project, because they knew I wasn't just parachuting in and then leaving. And I think so much of what we do as academics can be construed as what we're doing to work toward tenure. But when you're like us and you really care about not only the communities but the causes, I think the conversations are totally different. And it's very easy for you to embody what it is that you're doing,
Let me throw in that there are many blessings to embodiment, to celebrating the African American soul and how you wear your hair, or what clothes you wear, how you walk, how you talk, your performance of blackness. There are many blessings that come with that, but there are also some burdens. I not only had some language come from students and colleagues downtown that were critical of my attempt to embody my discourse, but I had to pay the black tax as a result too. I was down at JW Marriott a little after that, meeting one of my roommates from A Better Chance. I'm a product of A Better Chance. It takes kids from inner city areas and puts them in schools where they have a better chance to go to college. Lino Garcia, he was the general manager of ESPN Deportes. I met him. We hadn't seen each other in about 20 years in JW Marriott. After we'd met, I'm waiting in the lobby for my ride, and I'm approached by 3 guards. I look roughly like I do now. My fro was shorter. I didn't have even as much facial hair, but roughly the same. I was approached by 3 guards, and they sent the black one over, and the 2 white guards stood back. And I was dressed literally, Alyssa, like I am now. I did not have a tie. Otherwise, I had slacks, hard shoes, just like I am now. And the black guard walked over to me and said, sir, you're here to see someone. I said, yes, I am, but why aren't you asking anyone else in the lobby? Big lobby, a lot of people. He said, well, sir, we've been having a problem with transients. And I said, transient, I know that's, means homeless people, of course, but transients, I said, Now, the implication was clear, but as a lawyer, I want to hear him say it. So I said, you're saying I look like a transient? He said, sir, don't take it personally. At that point, the good thing about teaching at a place like University of Southern California Law School for over 20 years is you can call your students who are now partners at law firms. So I called one at Latham & Watkins, and then I started tweeting about this too. This is when my students got me on Twitter. So I started tweeting about this. I said, I know he's not going to come back, but if he does, I just want you to be on the phone. You know, I know it won't happen. He came back with the other two, this time closer. They said, sir, what is the name of the person you're here to see? I know both as a criminal law professor and as a tort professor how to translate that transaction in legal language now. He was saying if I don't give them the name of somebody they can find in their database, I've assumed the ejectable status of a trespasser, and they were about to lay hands on me and throw me out. So here's the situation I was confronted that black people confront thousands of times every day in America in paying the black tax. Either I give him Lino Garcia's name, swallow the indignity of the stereotypes he has about me because of the way I look, kind of validate and vindicate his perceptions of me on that basis, right? And to suffer that kind of spirit murder, which is what that is. Or on the other hand, and these are only two choices in the situation. Or on the other hand, frankly, I tell him to go fuck himself. All right? In that situation, I wind up in the back of a squad car, right? And you're hearing about it on the news, 6 and 11 o'clock news, USC criminal law professor arrested for criminal something.
No, the headlines,
right?
yes.
And there goes, tenure gives you a lot of protection, but not against that sort of stuff. So that, you know, pick your poison now as a black person in America. Which indignity are you going to swallow? Which form of spirit murder do you want? Right? And that's what a lot of times, and that's just because of my hair. When I look like Obama, I wasn't getting that. That's just because of the follicle fashion. And think about, I have a dark-skinned son, you know, who, it's not about hair. For him, it's about his face is much more threatening than just my hair, you know, and I have to think about the experience that he goes through and others, you know, in our community go through who can't just shave their hair down and put on a Brooks Brothers suit and look like Obama. So, you know, there are blessings, there are certainly blessings that come with being able to look like we want, walk like we want, and talk like we want, but the costs are real and significant. And that's what I think you were getting at when you, again, back to dismantling respectability, because I can't wait for the book now because I read the article about 3 times. Each time I got more and more out of it.
Thank you.
So I want to keep, you know, and you talked about how the women who are leading this movement, breaking away from the old model of men trying to take the thunder and roll with it, also had other ways of embodying their discourse. Right? But that embodiment came with a price.
It does.
So can you talk a little bit about that?
It does. I have a chapter in the book where I talk about police brutality looking like many different things. And it just perfectly dovetails with what you were just talking about. I describe an incident in Italy when I was there to lecture. And right at the outset, at immigration, there was an incident where one of the customs agents served a woman right before me, a couple, actually, an elderly couple who was white. And they were allowed to pass. They were given the Italian welcome, welcome in the Italian language. And I was marveling, like, oh, wow, the language sounds so beautiful. Can't wait to pick up a few phrases. The constant kind of standard fare when you enter a new country. You can't wait to kind of see what it has to offer. And I remember that customs agent holding up a newspaper when it was my turn to go up to get into the country. And I remember thinking, what is going on here? At first, I didn't recognize it. And I should say that at that time, I had what many black women call vacation braids, right? We had our vacation braids in. Mine happened to be Senegalese twists at the time. And I had no idea that there was a large migration of Senegalese people to the area. And during that time, he put that newspaper up and he started reading. He refused to serve me, refused to even let me pass. And there's a complete other window over here with 4 other customs agents who were laughing hysterically. And they were just beside themselves. And I had another friend who was with me. She's a physician, and she was just in tears. She just couldn't really hold back. And I should mention this time was 2016. This is just after Philando Castile was killed, just after Alton Sterling was killed, just 2 weeks after. And we were kind of afraid to travel in the first place, but we were like, well, we've heard that Italy was kind to African Americans during World War II. perhaps it'll be the same for us. And so to be met with that, and then she says, just come over here with me. And I scoot down and try to get in there. And I slide, my credentials under the window. And they say, well, who are you? And I say, well, I'm a professor and I'm here to lecture. No sooner than I said that, they're laughing and get, professor. And they're looking and turning the passport all around. And they said, well, you're African American? And I said, yes. Not African? I said, well, African American by way of. And so they said, well, what are you doing with these African stamps in your passport from Morocco and South Africa if you're not African? I said, well, I was working there. I was teaching there. And they were saying, a bunch of things in their own language. This went on for about 20 minutes. And then finally, they threw the passport, stamped it, threw it back through the hole. It fell on the ground. And there was an American woman who was white who was in tears. And she said, I am so sorry. Because as an American, she also knew what was going on in our country at the time. And she gave me my passport because I was frozen. I was just completely aghast that this was my introduction to Milan, Italy. And she, held my hand and patted it. And I'm still aghast. Can't say anything. And it reminded me so much of the shame that was attached to a traffic stop in New Orleans when I was a college student. I went to an HBCU, Xavier University, and it was known for having police kind of circle that area sometimes, and the women were always stopped, not necessarily the men, but it was always, hey, pretty lady, where are you headed, and those kinds of things. And that's why I was so glad when Kimberly Crenshaw came out with her Say Her Name movement, because as an attorney, she was also doing the work you're doing, calling forward that intersectionality and saying, here's where two different identities and two different constructs of oppression meet. And for us, police brutality looked different for Black women, but we recognized it. We recognized the fear, the humiliation, the shame. And so I weave that in to discuss that you cannot ignore those things. Because at first I was going to leave them out of the book. I'm like, this is a strictly academic study. We're talking about the history of African American journalism. My role doesn't really, it will muddle this thing. And then I thought I'd be very disingenuous to not talk about how my appearance and how it can change, and how people are kind of fascinated with how Black hair can change, can influence how I'm being treated on a day-to-day basis. And so as I began to, that was a very long trip. I was there for 2 weeks, and I did meet another Senegalese man. Incidentally, my friend and I were walking down the street, still kind of stunned by the treatment we had been receiving. And he said, sister, your hair. And he was almost in tears. And I said, oh, I'm African American. And I regret now saying it almost apologetically, because I knew that he would hear me speak and hear my accent and realize, oh, you're not all the way. And I think that rift is what a lot of African American scholars also are dealing with, is that we're trying to piece together not only a legacy here in America as an African American, but we're also trying to be a bridge to other stories, to know that we didn't start here and our history doesn't start here. And slavery may be part of that, but there were things going on before we even got here. And so even reaching back further to what those stories are can be jarring to some, but I think it's time. And I think that's why you saw such a great embrace of things like Black Panther taking off and Afrofuturism having this great revival, because I think a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement inspired and encouraged different ways of seeing. And if I can go back to Devin, he was very intent on showing the beauty in Blackness. And that's a movement that was 1970-ish in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement and what Brathwaite was doing with his photography and models. But I think that a lot of that is coming back, and social media helped that. So if we see things like Black Girl Magic and Carefree Black Boy and Black Men Smile and Black Men Embrace, that was the other side that is also lost sometimes when we talk about these things, is that being Black is joyous. It's fun. There's a lot of great creative forces that have come out of African American culture that journalists have helped highlight. And even some art forms, some Black art forms are journalism, like hip hop. So if we think about people like Kendrick Lamar, who is a Pulitzer Prize winning poet and rapper, we can think about some of his videos that he's done. For instance, Element is one of my favorite videos because it's full of Gordon Parks imagery, right? And so you can't really separate Black culture and Black journalism because we've been trying so many different years through so many different venues to tell our stories, whether it's the traditional way through newspapers, whether it's through the blues, whether it's through rap. We have always been trying to overcome and just show, yes, there's a struggle, but yes, there's joy here as well. And so that's what I'm most excited about, kind of exploring with this book. And
I love that, Alyssa, because I think we do have to spend a lot of time talking about the burdens of Blackness. And the reason we have to is because so many people want to deny that those burdens are there, they exist. They do these polls, 56% sometimes, and upwards of more than that. White people say they think that racism is a thing of the past and that the playing field is even now. And you look at the data and your jaw drops. You wonder what social reality they're living in. You go down here in Skid Row and you see that 75% here in LA of Skid Row is Black. Yet go into San Quentin and staggering, the same demographics are there in San Quentin in terms of the hyper concentration of Black bodies. So we have to bring home the fact that there are all these burdens associated with Blackness, but sometimes that doesn't allow us to celebrate the blessings of Blackness. You know, the kind of dual consciousness that comes with being Black that Du Bois talks about. That is having to master the narrative of the dominant group while you're also mastering your own out-group narrative. It gives you a kind of not only dual consciousness, but binocular disparity, right? You have to be able to see in stereo. That kind of binocular disparity is what makes depth perception possible. You can see nuance that others can't, who are, ensconced in their own cyclops world, of dominant gaze and perspective. And with that kind of binocular disparity and the depth perception and nuance that comes with it, you're a better scholar. You have greater insight. You're able to see around corners that others can't. So there are all those blessings of Blackness that should be celebrated as well in this month. And at the same time we're mindful of the burdens, we have to keep on bringing it to people's attention that they're out there, but we also got to celebrate the African American soul. And I think that means we're running kind of shy on time. So I'll let you close. I'll just say once again, my book is that's coming out is Nigger Theory, Race, Language, Unequal Justice, and the Law. And Roy P. Cocker, Professor of Law at University of Southern California, Gould School of Law.
I've been Alyssa Richardson from the Annenberg School. My book, which will be out in the spring, is Bearing Witness While Black, African Americans, Smartphones, and the New Protest Journalism. And I am an assistant professor here at the Annenberg School as well.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast and visit us at podcasts.usc.edu.